And this is the most important skill in photography. Fixing this one mistake will make your photos 10 times better. In today's video, we're going to talk about 10 common beginner photography mistakes that I see a lot of people make. If you've made one or more of these mistakes, don't be afraid to admit it. We're all photographers here, we're all learning. And that leads into the first mistake I see a lot of people make, and that is taking photos in direct sunlight. So you may be wondering, the sun's up for 12 to 15 hours a day. Do I have to take all my photos at night? And no, that's not what I mean by direct sunlight. By direct sunlight, I mean the time of day that's between noon and around 4 p.m. That's because the sun is high in the sky at that time, and that's when the sun produces the most harsh light and the brightest light. We never want harsh or bright light in our photo because it can completely ruin a photo. As you can see, I took these photos right here in direct sunlight, and as you can see, they're like really bright, and it's really hard to edit that out in post editing, and it never looks quite right when you take photos in direct sunlight. But if you take photos at the best time of day, which is sunset and sunrise, the photos look a lot better. And that's why a lot of portrait photography is taken around sunset or sunrise, or taken at night, because if you're taking portraits at high noon, you notice your subject, or you, if you're in the portrait, that you'll have to squint to see because the sun's shining directly in your eyes. We never want to take photos in direct sunlight for that reason. Even with landscape photography, direct sunlight does not look great. The next mistake I see a lot of photographers making, especially when they're beginning, is caring too much about gear. A lot of people will procrastinate and not even start taking photos because they feel like they don't have good enough gear to even start photography. And that's not the truth. Photography is not about the fancy gear, it's about the person taking the photos. So if you have a lot of knowledge about photography and you've learned a lot about photography, you can take good photos even without fancy gear. It all takes time and practice. Basically, work with the gear that you already have and learn how to use that gear to the best of its abilities. You can even start with an iPhone. Our iPhones take really good pictures nowadays. And the third mistake that I see a lot of photographers make is not subscribing to my YouTube channel. Make sure to press subscribe right there if you want to see more photography tutorials, gear reviews, and much more. Just kidding, that's not the third thing. Third mistake is actually not trying to learn more. What I mean by this is a lot of photographers that are advanced especially will act like they already know everything about photography, and they'll just be taking photos sometimes even months or years without learning anything new about taking photography. Photography is constantly evolving, and there's always new things you can learn with photography. Even if you're super advanced, you can learn something new. So what I try to do is I try to learn one thing new about photography a day, whether it's how to take a certain photo, maybe get some photography ideas. Just try to learn one new thing a day about photography. Number 4 is a huge mistake, and this is usually the most common mistake that I see, and that is bad composition. And this is the most important skill in photography. Fixing this one mistake will make your photos 10 times better. Basically, the number one thing you need to know about good composition is having a good background and not having things in the background. That's usually the number one thing I see that's mistaken in composition, is people have other things in the background or things they don't need in the background, and they won't adjust their photo. They'll just take the photo with those things in the background and be like, okay, whatever. Thing is, you always want to make sure your background is clean and that it looks good and that there's not a lot of distracting things in the background. Let me show you an example of a photo I took right here. See, the background's kind of distracting. There's a trash can in the background. First of all, we don't want that in the background. There's also a bunch of trees in the background, and the subject doesn't really stand out because of all that distracting stuff in the background. Here's another example of a photo. As you can see, the background's just a beach, and there's not a lot of distracting things that could distract you from the subject, and the subject clearly stands out. So that's why you want to make sure you have a good background and make sure your subject's standing out. I could honestly make a whole video on composition and everything you need to know about composition, so if you're interested in that, just let me know down below in the comments. But for time's sake, we're going to move on to the next mistake. The next mistake I see a lot of photographers make is making the people in their photos do too much posing. What I mean by this is like smiling pictures, hand on hip pictures, like all the common poses that we see in studio portrait photography that everyone's already seen. If you're taking any sort of photo that's not studio portraits, you want to do less common poses and not these poses that everyone sees in every single photo, because it kind of gets repetitive and doesn't make anyone stand out when they're all taking the same photos with the same poses. So if you want to make your photos stand out, I recommend changing the poses so they're less common poses and they tell a story. So to do this, you can do like natural movements like walking, or maybe you can do things like looking out over a view rather than sitting there and smiling with the view in the background. You know what I mean? Another common mistake that I see a lot is over editing your photos. I'm sure if you're on Instagram or any type of other photo sharing app, you've seen an over edited photo. It looks something like this. And a lot of people, when they first start editing their photos, they want to crank up the contrast, they want to crank up the saturation, and they want to color grade a lot to the point where the photo looks like a rainbow. We don't want to do that. If I can give one tip to not make this mistake, it's to just adjust your sliders to where they need to be and don't go overboard on any slider. I always like to stay in the middle of a slider that I feel like needs improvement, but I never want to go too low or too high on the slider, just right in the middle. Alright? Like I mentioned in tip number 1, the next mistake that I see a lot of people make is bad lighting. You need to have good lighting for your photo, because if you have too little lighting, your photo will become really grainy. But if you have too much lighting, like taking photos in direct sunlight, it will ruin the whole aesthetic of your photo and your photos won't look that great. That's why you want to make sure you always have perfect lighting and take photos at the right time of day. That way you don't make the mistake of not being able to see the photo or the photo not looking aesthetically pleasing. And one way you can do this, and this is the next mistake I see a lot of people make, is having their shutter speed too slow. So a slow shutter speed would be anything around 1/60th of a second or anything lower. The reason why it's kind of bad to have a low shutter speed unless you need it, unless you're taking long exposure photography or you're taking photos at night, is because the lower your shutter speed, the more light gets let in. So either your photo is going to be really bright and you can't see anything, or the photo will be really shaky, because if you're taking handheld photos with your camera on 1/60th of a second or lower, camera will begin to show camera shake because the shutters open longer. So I always recommend to have your shutter speed high when you can. And the 10th and final mistake I see a lot of people use is using the wrong type of lenses for the wrong type of photo. So there's a general rule with lenses. You want to use a 35mm or lower lens if you're taking like landscapes. That's because 35mm is a wide lens and that shows the whole area around you and you're able to see the whole area of the landscape. For anything where you're taking pictures of people, which is usually portraits, I would recommend 55 to 85mm. 50mm lens is great for medium to full body portraits, and if you're taking close-up portraits, I would recommend an 85mm because I believe this is best for close-up portraits since it's a closer lens. It makes the photos look more natural since you're getting closer to your subject. So that's 10 mistakes I see a lot of photographers make, and if you want to learn how to instantly take better photos, I have a video on that right here, and if you want to learn how to better edit your videos and take your edits to the next level, I have a video on it right here. If you like this video and I gave you any value today, just make sure to give a like to the video because that would really help me out. Also, make sure to press subscribe right there if you want to learn more about photography and more about photo editing and gear reviews and things such as that. Thank you for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.